Frank Dawson wiped the sweat from his brow as the Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on his weathered skin. At 58, the rancher had spent most of his life on this stretch of land near the San Carlos Apache Reservation, just east of Phoenix. The drought had been brutal this year, turning the usually golden landscape into a harsh expanse of cracked earth and withered vegetation. His ranch hand, Miguel, approached on horseback, dust trailing behind him. "Mr. Dawson, they're here." Frank nodded grimly. He'd been expecting this visit since receiving the call from social services last week. His late sister's granddaughter, a girl he'd never met, had nowhere else to go. Her mother, Lisa, had passed away unexpectedly, and there was no father in the picture. At his age, taking in a 12-year-old Apache girl wasn't something he'd planned for, but family was family, even distant ones. The social worker's sedan kicked up dust as it pulled into the driveway. Frank straightened his hat and walked toward the vehicle, his boots crunching on the gravel. A middle-aged woman in a business suit emerged, looking painfully out of place in the rural setting. Behind her, a small figure lingered in the shadows of the car. "Mr. Dawson? I'm Janet Kemp from Arizona Child Services." She extended her hand, which Frank shook firmly. "Ma'am." He nodded, his eyes drifting to the car. "This is Nina," Janet said, gesturing to the girl who reluctantly stepped forward, clutching a worn backpack to her chest. She was small for her age, with long black hair that fell past her shoulders and dark, wary eyes that refused to meet his gaze. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a faded t-shirt with a geometric pattern that Frank recognized as traditional Apache design. "Hello, Nina." Frank's voice softened instinctively. "I'm your great-uncle Frank." The girl didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the ground. Janet cleared her throat. "As I mentioned on the phone, Nina hasn't spoken since her mother's passing 3 months ago. The doctors say there's no physical reason, it's psychological. Trauma-induced selective mutism." Frank frowned. No one had told him that. "She understands everything," Janet continued. "She just doesn't speak. Her school records show she's quite bright. She was in the gifted program before." Frank nodded, unsure what to say. He'd raised cattle, not children. After signing the necessary paperwork and receiving a folder containing Nina's medical records and school information, Frank watched the social worker's car disappear down the long driveway. He stood awkwardly beside the silent girl, both of them strangers connected by the thinnest thread of family. "Well," he finally said, picking up her small suitcase, "let me show you your room." The house was modest but comfortable, a ranch-style home with wooden floors and simple furniture. Frank led her to a small bedroom that had once belonged to his sister when she visited. He'd spent the weekend clearing out old boxes and putting fresh sheets on the bed, but the room still felt like a museum to a different time. "It's not much, but it's yours now. You can put up pictures or whatever you like." He set down her suitcase. "Bathrooms across the hall. We eat dinner at 6. Nina entered the room cautiously, like a wild animal sensing a trap. She placed her backpack on the bed and stood still, waiting. "I'll let you get settled," Frank said, backing toward the door. "I've got chores to finish. Miguel, he works the ranch with me. He's got a daughter about your age. Carmen, maybe you'll meet her sometime." No response. That evening, dinner was a silent affair. Frank wasn't much of a talker himself, but the absence of even basic conversation made the clinking of forks against plates uncomfortably loud. He'd made a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread, and while Nina ate, she kept her eyes on her plate. "School starts in 3 weeks, Frank said, trying to fill the silence. "It's a small school, about 20 minutes from here. Lots of kids from the reservation go there." Nina continued eating methodically. After dinner, Frank watched from the porch as Nina walked to the edge of the property, where the land sloped gently toward a cluster of ancient cottonwood trees. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, a daily Arizona spectacle that never grew old. The girl stood alone, facing the distant mountains of the reservation, her mother's homeland. Frank sighed deeply. He had no idea how to reach her, how to help her. The silence between them felt as vast as the desert itself. 2 weeks passed with little change. Nina moved through the ranch like a ghost, silent and watchful. During the day, she mostly stayed in her room or wandered the property, always keeping a distance from the ranch operations. Frank tried to respect her space while establishing a routine. He'd leave breakfast on the table before heading out to work, and she'd appear after he was gone, the empty plate later evidence she'd eaten. One morning, Frank knocked gently on her door. "Nina, I need to go into town for supplies. Thought you might want to come along. Maybe pick out some things for school." After a moment, the door opened. Nina stood there, already dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She nodded once. The drive to the small town of Globe was 45 minutes of silence, broken only by the country music playing softly on the radio. Frank occasionally pointed out landmarks, an old mining site, a historic trading post, a ridge where Apache scouts had once kept watch for cavalry movements over a century ago. Nina's eyes followed his gestures, but her expression remained unreadable. At the department store, Frank awkwardly navigated the girls' clothing section. "Pick out whatever you need," he said, relieved when Nina began selecting items: practical clothes, a few notebooks, and a backpack with a geometric pattern similar to her t-shirt. Her choices were decisive and minimal. No fuss, no hesitation. At the checkout, the cashier, a friendly older woman named Debbie, smiled warmly. "Well, who's this young lady?" "My great-niece, Nina. She's staying with me now," Frank replied, his hand resting awkwardly on Nina's shoulder. "Welcome to Globe, sweetheart. You going to start at Lincoln Elementary?" Debbie directed her question to Nina. Frank interceded when Nina remained silent. "She'll be at San Carlos Unified. She's Apache." Debbie's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, that's nice. They have a good cultural program there, I hear." On their way out, they passed a music store. Nina paused, her attention caught by a small wooden flute in the window display. "You want to look?" Frank asked. To his surprise, Nina nodded and entered the store. She moved directly to the display of Native American instruments, her fingers hovering over the cedar flute. "That's a traditional Apache flute," the store owner explained, approaching them. "This one's made by an artisan from San Carlos." Frank noticed a change in Nina's demeanor, a subtle tension, a focus he hadn't seen before. "You play?" he asked her. She shook her head but continued to stare at the instrument. Her mother was from San Carlos, Frank explained to the owner. "Was she a musician?" the man asked. "I don't know," Frank admitted, realizing how little he knew about his niece's family. "Did your mom play, Nina?" Nina nodded, the movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. Frank made his decision quickly. "We'll take it." That night, Frank sat on the porch, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the sunset. The ranch hands had gone home, and the property was quiet except for the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. He wondered if he'd made a mistake buying the flute, if it would bring back painful memories for Nina. Movement caught his eye. Nina had emerged from the house and was walking toward the cottonwood trees, the flute in her hand. Frank remained still, not wanting to intrude on whatever private moment she was seeking. Under the spreading branches of the ancient tree, Nina sat cross-legged on the ground. The moon was rising, nearly full, casting silver light across the landscape. For several minutes, she simply sat there, holding the flute. Then, slowly, she raised it to her lips. The sound that emerged was hesitant at first, a few tentative notes floating on the night air. But gradually, a melody took shape, haunting and beautiful. Frank found himself holding his breath. The song wasn't practiced or perfect, but it carried emotion that transcended technique. When she finished, silence reclaimed the night. Frank watched as Nina's shoulders began to shake. Even from a distance, he could tell she was crying, the first emotion she'd openly displayed since her arrival. He debated going to her, but decided against it. Some grief needed space to breathe. Later that night, as Frank passed her room, he heard something that made him pause. A voice, soft, barely audible, singing in a language he didn't understand. The Apache words floated through the closed door like a secret confession to the darkness. He stood frozen, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile moment of breakthrough. Frank leaned against the wall, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. She could speak, or at least, she could sing. It wasn't much, but it was something. A beginning. The first day of school arrived with a brilliant Arizona sunrise. Frank had risen early to make a proper breakfast, eggs, bacon, and toast, determined to start the day right. To his surprise, Nina appeared in the kitchen fully dressed, her new backpack already slung over one shoulder. "Morning," Frank said, sliding a plate toward her. "Big day." Nina sat and began eating methodically. Frank noticed she'd braided her hair in a traditional style, with a small turquoise bead woven into one of the braids. It reminded him of the way his sister used to wear her hair, decades ago. "I called the school yesterday," Frank said, pouring himself coffee. "Told them about your situation. They've got a counselor who works with kids from the reservation. Said she'd check in with you today." Nina paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. For a moment, Frank thought she might speak, but she only nodded and continued eating. The drive to San Carlos Unified School was quiet, the radio filling the silence between them. As they approached the modest brick building, Frank noticed Nina's knuckles whitening as she gripped her backpack straps. "I'll pick you up at 3:30, he said as he pulled up to the drop-off area. "Right here." Nina looked at the school, then back at Frank. Something passed across her face, fear, perhaps, or resolve. She reached out suddenly and squeezed his arm, the first time she'd initiated contact, before sliding out of the truck and walking toward the entrance, her back straight and her steps measured. Frank watched until she disappeared inside, an unexpected heaviness in his chest. The ranch would feel empty today. When 3:30 came, Frank was waiting, his truck idling in the pickup line. Nina emerged with a flood of students, walking alone but not looking distressed. As she climbed into the truck, Frank resisted the urge to barrage her with questions. "How'd it go?" he asked simply. Nina shrugged, but pulled a folder from her backpack and handed him a note. It was from her teacher, Mrs. Begay. "Mr. Dawson, Nina did well today. She participated in class by writing her responses. She sat with a few girls at lunch who are also from San Carlos. We have a cultural program on Wednesdays that I think she might enjoy. Traditional crafts and language. Please let me know if she can participate. Eleanor Begay. Want to do this Wednesday thing?" Frank asked, handing the note back. Nina nodded, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly, almost a smile. That evening, after dinner, Nina surprised Frank by joining him on the porch rather than retreating to her room. She brought a textbook and sat in the wicker chair next to his, opening to a page about Arizona history. "Homework?" Frank asked. She nodded, then pointed to a paragraph about the Apache Wars of the 1870s. Frank leaned over to read it. "That's simplified history," he said with a frown. "My grandfather told stories about that time. His father was a cavalry scout. Not proud of it, but that's our family history. Your great-great-grandfather on your grandmother's side." Nina looked up at him, her dark eyes questioning. "Your mother's grandmother, my sister. She married a man from San Carlos. James Talkalai. Good man. Served in Vietnam. That's how you're connected to both worlds." Frank hadn't talked about family history in years. "I've got some old photos somewhere, if you want to see them." Nina nodded, and for the first time, Frank felt something shift between them, a bridge beginning to form across the chasm of silence. The next morning, Miguel's daughter Carmen came to the ranch to help with weekend chores. At 16, she was tall and confident, chatting easily as she worked alongside her father. Frank introduced Nina, explaining in a low voice about her mutism. "Cool," Carmen said, unfazed. "Want to help me feed the horses?" To Frank's surprise, Nina agreed readily, following Carmen to the stables. Throughout the morning, he watched the girls work together, Carmen doing all the talking but seeming comfortable with Nina's silent participation. By midday, they were sitting under the shade of the porch, Carmen showing Nina how to braid leather for a bracelet. That night, Frank was awakened by a sound he couldn't immediately identify. He lay still, listening. It came again, singing, soft but clear, drifting through the open window. He rose and moved quietly to the back porch. Nina was sitting on the steps, singing to the moon. The melody was different from before, more structured, like a traditional song passed down through generations. Though Frank couldn't understand the Apache words, The emotion in her voice transcended language. It spoke of loss, of memory, of things too profound for everyday speech. When she finished, Frank cleared his throat gently to announce his presence. Nina turned, moonlight silvering her face. For a moment, they regarded each other in silence. "That was beautiful," Frank said finally. "Your mother taught you that song." Nina nodded. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke her first words to him. "It helps her find me." Frank sat down slowly beside Nina, careful to maintain some distance, as if she were a deer that might bolt at any sudden movement. The night air was cool, a relief after the scorching day, and the stars spread across the sky in brilliant profusion. "Your mother," Frank said gently. "You think she can't hear you?" Nina drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "In our tradition," she said, her voice soft but steady, "songs help guide spirits. The elders say the dead can find their way to us when we sing the old songs." Frank nodded, not knowing what to say. He wasn't a religious man, and his own understanding of Apache spiritual beliefs was limited at best. But he respected the comfort such traditions could bring. "I didn't know your mother well," he admitted. "Lisa visited here with your grandmother a few times when she was young, but after your grandmother passed, we lost touch." "She talked about this place sometimes," Nina said, each word seeming to require effort, as if she were remembering how to use her voice. "She said her grandfather, your father, was kind to her, even though she was Apache." The observation hit Frank like a physical blow. "Times were different then," he said finally. "Not that it excuses anything. People should have known better." They sat in silence for a while, the distant yip of coyotes the only sound. "Mom played the flute," Nina continued unexpectedly. "She taught me some songs, but I'm not very good yet." "Sounded pretty good to me," Frank offered. Nina shook her head. "She said music was our first language, before words. That's why babies sing before they talk." She paused. "When she died, words didn't work anymore, but the songs still do." Frank felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry about your mom, Nina. I wish I'd known her better." "She had your picture," Nina said, "on her dresser. You and Grandma Sarah, standing by a horse." Frank remembered the photo, taken at least 30 years ago, when his sister had last visited the ranch. He hadn't known Lisa had kept it. The next morning, Frank found Nina at the kitchen table, a notebook open in front of her. He poured himself coffee, trying to act normally despite the significance of the previous night's conversation. "Mrs. Begay wants me to write about family traditions," Nina said, without looking up. Her voice was stronger in the daylight, more confident. Frank nodded, uncertain whether to comment on her speaking aloud. "What are you writing about?" "The night singing," she replied. "It's what my mother called it. In our family, the women sing to the moon when someone dies, for a full cycle, 1 month. It helps the spirit find peace." "Is that what you've been doing?" Frank asked, realizing she'd been at the ranch almost exactly a month. Nina nodded. "Tonight is the last night." At school, Nina began participating more actively, writing answers on the whiteboard when called upon, though she still didn't speak in class. Mrs. Begay reported that she'd made friends with 2 girls from the reservation, and on Wednesday afternoons, she joined the cultural program, where elders taught traditional crafts, language, and music. Carmen became a regular presence at the ranch, stopping by after school several times a week. She taught Nina to ride, starting with an old, gentle mare named Pepper. Frank watched from the corral fence as Nina's initial nervousness gave way to growing confidence. "She's a natural," Miguel commented, standing beside Frank. "Has good hands. Gentle but firm." Frank nodded, a sense of pride surprising him. Her grandmother was the same way. "My sister could outride most of the boys around here." One afternoon, Frank returned from checking the north pasture to find Carmen's truck still parked by the house, though it was later than she usually stayed. As he approached, he heard something unexpected: laughter. Nina's laughter, bright and clear, floating from the back porch. He rounded the corner to find the girls sitting at the picnic table, a collection of beads and leather strips spread before them. Carmen was demonstrating how to create a pattern, and Nina was following along, her dark head bent in concentration. "Mr. Dawson." Carmen greeted him. "I'm teaching Nina how to make moccasins. My grandmother showed me." "I see that," Frank replied, his eyes on Nina, who looked up and met his gaze steadily. "Looks like good work." "Frank," Nina said, the first time she'd addressed him by name. "Can Carmen stay for dinner?" The simple question, asked in a normal voice, struck Frank as momentous. "Of course," he said, keeping his tone casual despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I was thinking of grilling steaks." "Awesome," Carmen grinned. "Nina's going to teach me an Apache song after. She says I have a good ear." That night, after Carmen had gone home, Frank found the old photo albums in the hall closet. He brought them to the living room, where Nina was reading a book Mrs. Begay had lent her, a collection of Apache legends transcribed in both English and Western Apache. "Thought you might want to see these," he said, placing the albums on the coffee table. "There are pictures of your grandmother, and a few of your mother when she was little." Nina set aside her book and moved to sit beside him on the sofa. Frank opened the first album, pointing to a black and white photograph of a young woman standing beside a 1960s pickup truck. "That's Sarah, your grandmother, when she was about 20. The final night of Nina's singing ritual arrived with a full moon that hung low and luminous over the desert landscape. Frank had spent the day making preparations, though he hadn't told Nina of his plans. After dinner, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "I thought maybe, if it's okay with you, I could come along tonight, for the last song." He hurried to add, "I'd stay back, out of the way, just to be there." Nina looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable. Then she nodded. "My mother would like that." They walked together toward the cottonwood trees as twilight deepened into night. Frank carried a small folding chair and a thermos of coffee. Nina brought her flute and a small cloth bundle. "This was my mother's," she explained, unwrapping a bracelet made of silver and turquoise. "I wear it when I sing the last song." Under the trees, Nina selected a spot where moonlight filtered through the branches. Frank set up his chair at a respectful distance, feeling both privileged to be included and uncertain of his role in this sacred moment. Nina slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, took a deep breath, and began to play the flute. The melody was different from what Frank had heard before, more complex, with a rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat. After a few minutes, she set the flute aside and began to sing. Her voice rose clear and strong in the night air, the Apache words flowing like water over stones. Though Frank couldn't understand the language, he felt the emotion behind it: grief and love, memory and release. Nina's face in the moonlight was transformed, her features echoing those of her ancestors, connecting past and present in an unbroken chain. When the song ended, silence fell between them, deep and comfortable. Nina wiped tears from her cheeks, but didn't look away. For the first time, she seemed at peace. "In the tradition," she said finally, after the last song, "we share stories about the person who has gone, so they know they're remembered." Frank nodded, understanding now why she had wanted him there. "Would you like to tell me about your mother?" Nina smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "She was stubborn, like you." She settled onto the ground, cross-legged. She worked as a nurse at the reservation clinic. She could calm anyone, even the crankiest elders. She made everyone feel safe. As the night deepened, Nina shared stories of her life with Lisa: camping trips to the White Mountains, learning to make traditional foods, nights spent stargazing from their apartment balcony in Phoenix. Frank listened, occasionally offering what few memories he had of Lisa as a child. "She had a way with horses, even as a little girl," he recalled. "Fearless. Your grandmother was always worried she'd break her neck, but Lisa just had this connection with animals." "Like me," Nina said softly. "Yes," Frank agreed. "Like you." The moon had traveled halfway across the sky when they finally walked back to the house, a new understanding between them. At the porch steps, Nina paused. "Thank you," she said simply. Frank nodded, words suddenly difficult to find. "Your mother would be proud of you, Nina. I know I am." The next morning, Frank woke to the smell of coffee brewing. He found Nina in the kitchen, attempting to make pancakes. The first batch was slightly burned, but she was undeterred, carefully pouring more batter into the pan. "Morning," she said, glancing up. "I found your recipe card in the drawer." "Sarah's recipe," Frank said, reaching for a mug. "Your grandmother made the best pancakes in Gila County." They ate breakfast together, discussing plans for the weekend. Miguel and Carmen were coming over to help move cattle to the south pasture, and Nina asked if she could ride along. "If you feel ready," Frank said. "It's real work, not just riding around." "I'm ready," she assured him. Later that day, as Frank watched Nina ride confidently alongside Carmen, giving hand signals to help guide the cattle, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of family, of continuity. This land that had been in the Dawson family for generations was now connected to the Apache heritage of his great-niece. Two traditions intertwining like streams converging. That evening, Mrs. Begay called with unexpected news. The school was organizing a cultural exchange program, and Nina had been selected to participate in a performance of traditional Apache music at a festival in Phoenix. "She'll need to speak to introduce her piece," Mrs. Begay explained. "I wasn't sure if she can do it," Frank said confidently. "She's found her voice again." After hanging up, he relayed the news to Nina, who was sitting on the porch, working on her moccasins. "What do you think?" he asked. "Feel up to performing in front of an audience?" Nina considered the question seriously. "I think Mom would want me to share the music," she said finally, "to keep the tradition alive." Frank nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words. "Then that's what you'll do. And I'll be there in the front row." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, casting long shadows across the ranch, Nina began to hum softly. Not a song of mourning this time, but melody of continuation, of life moving forward while honoring what came before. Frank joined her on the porch, and together they watched darkness fall and the first stars appear. Two people from different worlds finding common ground under the vast Arizona sky.